Hold the line. Sector: Segmentum Solar, World, Armageddon, Province, Armageddon Prime, Regiment. Cadian 266th Shock Infantry, Mission. 266th Regiment has been placed in the mountain passes to the east of High Volcanus. The 266th are to dig in and fortify the pass. Estimated enemy arrival in 3 days. Hold the line. Chapter 1, Aftermath. Walking down the trench system, Sergeant Darren Vale dodged bodies of Guardsmen and greenskins alike. The whole trench was littered with the dead, making the smell unbearable to any person who hadn't been smelling it for the last 4 days. The last assault started 2 hours after first light and didn't end until 5 hours before last light. This became the daily routine for the 266th for the last 4 days since the first Orc assault. Coming to a cross-section in the trench system, Vale entered a makeshift bunker there. Laying on an equally makeshift bed was the Commissar with a medic. The Commissar was wounded badly in the last Orc attack, where he took a shot tearing off his left arm from the elbow down. The Commissar gestured towards the medic with a wave of his hand, prompting them to leave. The Commissar turned his gaze back to Vale.
"Report, Sergeant."
It took the man great effort to speak those 2 words, coughing after the sentence. Vale straightened his back before he spoke.
"The greenskin assault was repelled, taking out most of their remaining armor."
"And us, Sergeant?"
Vale glanced down for a second before continuing.
"3rd Company is down to 23 Guardsmen remaining, 1 Chimera transport and the heavy gun emplacement next to it."
The Commissar interrupted.
"And what of 4th Company?"
Vale replied swiftly.
"Better than us. The main assaults focused on our trench system."
The Commissar lowered his head back onto the bed.
23, reduced from 150.
Looking back to Vale.
"Hold the line, Sergeant. You are in charge of 3rd Company in my stead."
Vale held his fist to his chest before turning and leaving the bunker. Chapter 2. Last light, dusk pressed heavy on the battered trench, the dying light a weak orange smear through the smoke curling above the mountains. Sergeant Vale ducked into a dugout just off the main trench, pushing aside the damp tarp that served as its only door. Inside, 4 Cadian guardsmen crowded close together, perched on ammo crates and battered packs, their faces thrown into sharp relief by the pale light of a flickering lamp. Each nursed a battered tin, the dull tap of spoons against metal, the only sound in the sudden hush. Vale dropped down beside them, letting the warmth from their small circle press against his aching side. The silence lingered as he reached for a ration tin, pulling the lid back and letting the dull, familiar scent of recycled protein waft up. He glanced around the dugout, meeting the guardsmen's eyes. Their faces, young, dirt-streaked, edged with the haunted look of those who had seen too much, watched him expectantly. Outside, the wind carried the acrid stench of cordite and decay, and the distant rumble of artillery punctuated the silence like a grim heartbeat. Roars occasionally echoing across the pass, a constant reminder that the siege was not over. Vale saw the tension in their hunched shoulders, the exhaustion that made their eyes old before their time. He set his ration aside, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. "We're all that's left of 3rd, he began, his voice low but steady.
23. But we hold this pass, just like the Commissar ordered. We hold, and we make them pay for every inch."
A ripple of determination, or perhaps desperation, passed through the group. One of the younger guardsmen, Jackran, barely more than a boy, nodded, jaw clenched.
"We'll hold, Sergeant. We have to."
Vale offered a rare, fleeting smile.
"That's the spirit. The Chimera is still running, and the heavy emplacement got enough juice for another barrage. We'll rig the outer trenches with what promethium we've got left. Once it's dark, I want sentries doubled. No one gets through without us knowing."
He paused, listening to the wind, a reminder of the empty and battered line they clung to.
"Eat. Rest as best you can. When it comes, we hold them here, as ordered, and 3rd Company will follow the orders."
For a while, the only sound was the scrape of spoons and the muted sigh of wind at the dugout flap. Then Corporal Kellen broke the silence, his voice gruff but soft.
4 days,
He muttered, staring into his tin.
feels like a lifetime. Barely a platoon left off the company in less than a week.
Kellen, his uniform stained with mud and cordite, let out a hollow chuckle.
At least half.
He said,
Remember Holst? Always said he'd make it off this rock, retire somewhere warm on Cadian. Orc shell landed right in the latrine. Damn fool luck.
Jackran's eyes flickered to the lamp, shadows dancing across his young face.
I still hear them sometimes. The shouting when the line broke. Laris and Diane holding the comms bunker while we pulled back.
He swallowed hard, jaw tight. Did they ever? Lyra shook her head, braids swinging.
Didn't see them after the second assault.
She hesitated, eyes shining in the low light.
I tried to get to them, but the greenskins were already in the trench. Thane dragged me back. I was almost...
She stopped, the memory raw. Thane, older and stoic, simply nodded.
Cost us plenty to hold,
He said,
That first day we lost Meikle and the twins at the wire. Then the command squad got overrun.
Kellen ran a hand over his face.
And the Medikey. Old Doc Parn. No one saw him after the field aid station burned.
Vale listened, letting their voices fill the cramped space, grief and memory mingling with the scratch of utensils. He looked at each in turn, sensing how much they'd all aged in 4 days.
We lost friends,
He said quietly.
lost more than that. But the past still stands, and so do we.
Jackran managed a wan smile.
Third Company,
He echoed, as if the words alone might anchor him.
maybe there's not much left, but we're still here.
Lyra lifted her tin in a silent toast.
For those who aren't, and for Holst, who never got his son.
The lamplight flickered as a gust pressed at the tarp. Outside, the night deepened, and the war's shadow pressed close. But for a fleeting moment, inside that battered dugout, memory and solidarity warmed the shattered survivors of Third. Chapter 3, Rest Up. Chapter 3, Rest Up. Vale was scraping the bottom of his tin of corpse starch before looking down to see the empty tin before letting out a sigh.
Very well. I will be getting some rest. Now I suggest you lot do the same.
Turning to Corporal Kellen, the two locking eyes.
Kellen, I want you to make the list for sentries tonight, then get some sleep. You will not be doing the sentry tonight. The Emperor knows how long it will take you to write that list.
Kellen took to his feet and punched his fist into his chest,
Yes, Sergeant!
with Vale returning the gesture before making his exit out under the tarp. Kellen turned back to the group and took out a battered clump of paper that once was a notebook before raising his head.
Jackran, Lyra. You two jump on the sentry first for me while I write this list. Hopefully you'll only do one tonight.
Jaskrin and Lyra grabbed their last rifles and pulled themselves to their feet.
Same position as last night.
Lyra asked.
I've not heard any change in the location.
Kellen replied. The pair made for the exit before Kellen stopped them by saying,
The heavy bolter got moved to the sentry position. Make sure it's loaded and oiled and tell the next two to check it over as well.
Jackran nodded,
Will do.
lifting the tarp for both him and Lyra. Chapter 4, Sentry Duty. Jackran and Lyra stepped out of the dugout, boots sinking into the packed mud, before turning to their right and following the trench. Walking for a minute, they arrived at the sentry position. The air tasted cold, sharp with the memory of cordite and the metallic tang of old blood. Moonlight silvered the battered landscape, lending a ghostly sheen to everything it touched. The ruined wire, the jagged lips of shell craters, the bodies, too many for comfort, but not enough to obscure the field of fire. They settled behind the heavy bolter, checking its feed and action with the mechanical precision that comes from necessity. 30, maybe 40 feet ahead, the smaller trench was a splintered grave, walls blown out and collapsed in a confusion of earth and broken timber. Not long ago, it had held their own. Now it offered nothing but cover for the dead. The whole system was narrow, perhaps 200 meters from mountain to mountain. Sheer cliffs boxed them in, unforgiving barriers that pressed the survivors into a tight line of defense. Out front, beyond the ruined trench, stretched an open plain, flat and treacherous. That was the killing ground, and for 4 days straight, the orcs had surged from its horizon, relentless as floodwater. Tonight, at least, the moon gave them better vision. Lyra swept the bolter's barrel across the open ground, eyes scanning for movement, while Jackrun peered through battered magnoculars at distant shadows. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the slow wind and the crackle of the tarp behind.
Better visibility won't help if they come in numbers.
Lyra murmured. Jackrun nodded, jaw set. Both understood the odds, but neither looked away. Not from the dead piled before them, nor from the open ground where tomorrow might bring another tide. They kept watch, moonlight cold on their faces, as the minutes unspooled and the battered pass held its breath. After a time, Lyra shifted her weight, glancing sidelong at Jackrun.
When this is all done,
She said, voice low but carrying,
what do you think you'll do? Assuming we're not feeding the worms out there. Hoist always used to talk about opening a tap house on some backwater. Sounded idyllic, didn't it? Think you'll end up somewhere like that?
Jackrun let out a breath that was almost a laugh, his eyes never leaving the horizon.
Not sure I'm cut out for pouring drinks,
He said,
honestly. I just want to get back to Cadia. See my folks. Been years since I've set foot there. They probably think I'm dead already. Maybe if the Emperor is willing, snag a promotion. Corporal Jackrun's got a nice ring, don't you think?
He managed a tired grin.
Bit more pay, a bit less scut work.
He turned his head, studying Lyra in the pale light.
What about you?
He asked.
Suppose the war ends tomorrow. What's next for you?
Lyra hesitated, her fingers drumming an idle tattoo on the bolter's casing. She looked away, jaw working as if to find words that had not yet settled in her mind.
I haven't really given it too much thought.
She admitted, tracing a scratch in the gunmetal with her thumb.
But I suppose I'd like to travel. Maybe to Baal. See the statue of the great angel with my own eyes. Stand beneath it, you know. And the Holy Fortress Monastery. I've heard the sun hits those towers just so at dawn, like the whole place is burning with gold.
She shrugged, a small, almost embarrassed smile ghosting across her lips.
Can't say I've ever worshipped much, but it'd be something, wouldn't it? Just to see it. To know it's real.
She fell quiet, the wind tugging at stray hairs beneath her helmet.
Maybe that's enough for now, just to dream about somewhere that isn't here.
Chapter 5, The Kasrkin. Hearing footsteps from behind, Jackrun turned, laying his eyes on the two that will relieve them. Malric Soren and one other who Jackrun knew the face of, but not the name. Malric Soren, the Chimera's gunner, was a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped hair and oil-stained sleeves, his deep purple eyes always alert. Gruff but quick to laugh with Jackrun, he carried the stubborn optimism of a veteran who'd survived too many battles by grit and good humor alone.
Jackrun, thank the Emperor you're okay. When I saw that orc jump into your trench, I feared the worst.
Jackrun stood up and closed the distance towards Malric.
The green-skinned bastard almost did get me. Knocked me to the ground, in fact. Luckily, Sergeant Vale appeared out of nowhere and shot it point-blank to the side of the head with his last pistol before kicking it out the way, so it didn't crush me.
Finally stopping right in front of Malric and raising his hand.
By the throne, you are a lucky one. And your sergeant, very well done. That's Kasrkin for you.
Lifting his own hand to complete the shake.
Kasrkin!
Jackrun looked stunned,
Vale was Kasrkin?
both of their hands retreating to the last guns they carried.
You didn't know, did you, Lyra?
She shook her head.
Ah, really, he's kept that secret close to the chest.
Passing by Jackrun before turning back around to face him.
How do you know he was Kasrkin?
Jackrun questioned.
Well, that's because I was here when he joined the 266th. Used to be his squad's taxi, in fact.
Malik smirked.
Now you're the Commissar's personal taxi.
Jackrun said with a laugh.
Aye, I've gone up in the world.
Malric replied with a chuckle. Jackrun looked excited,
Do you know what he did with them?
his giddiness showing enough to make Lyra giggle, but Jackrun did not notice. Malric did notice, however, which brought a smile to his face, before pressing his finger to his chin, trying to think. The faintest glint of a memory passing behind his eyes. He tapped the side of his helmet as though clearing static.
So, Sergeant Vale?
His voice rough and measured.
Didn't talk about it much. Got told by some officer the day he got moved to us.
He paused, letting the memory settle, the starlight cold on his brow.
Heard a few stories, though. Rumors, mostly. The kind that drift between regiments and grow teeth. One said he put down a traitor Astartes on Cadia in one of the Belak crusades. Can't say if it's true, but they say it was quick. One shot, clean through the helmet. Others claim he led a dozen out of a collapsing bastion, held the breach until the last evac, then vanished with nothing but a knife and a data slate.
Malric's gaze lingered on the battered bolter, then lifted to the dark horizon.
Never saw him lose his head, not once. Even when the shells came down and the comms went dead. Folk like that, they carry weight, you feel. Like the air gets heavier when they walk past.
He fell silent, the night swelling with old ghosts and half-spoken legends. The stories of Vale, part truth, part myth, threaded invisibly through the trench, another kind of defense against the darkness pressing in from all sides.
But you two go and get some rest now. Can't be up all night listening to me waffle on. Go get.
See ya, Malric,
said Jacrin as he nodded and turned. Lyra stood and followed behind, catching Malik look at her and glancing back at Jacrin, who had started walking, then back to Lyra and raised an eyebrow, causing Lyra to shake her head and smile. Chapter 6, First Light. Dawn crept over the scarred earth in hesitant increments, the first fragile glimmer of sunlight catching on coils of barbed wire and shattered embankments. The horizon kindled with a smouldering line of gold. At first, no more than a rumor in the darkness, then steadily brightening, bleeding warmth into the chill air. Shadows gathered in the bottom of the trench, stretching long and spectral, retreating as the light grew bolder. Rusted gunmetal, battered helmets, and the blackened faces of sandbags took on the faintest flush of color, as if the world itself exhaled after a breath held too long. The sun's edge breached the rim of the world, spilling amber over the battered parapets, carving each figure in the trenches into silhouettes half-formed from night and morning. Dew shimmered on every surface, transforming the mud and ruin for a moment into something precious, almost beautiful. In those first rays, the trenches lost some of their menace. The gloom that had pressed so heavy through the night gave way to clarity, harsh, honest, but alive. It was a new day on the line, and for a fleeting instant, the defenders of the 266th stood in the promise of a world remade by the sunrise. Thane lay atop a sleeping mat, torn and ragged but clean, due to Thane's great effort to keep it out of the mud the last 4 nights. His eyes shot open when a guardsman started shaking his boot.
It's first light. Orders are to wake everyone up.
The woman said softly before turning and set off to the next person down the trench. Thane sat up as if he was coming back to life. There he looked around, taking in the morning air and the golden hue that the sun gave the ground. Grabbing his lad gun, he stumbled to his feet. Thane slung the laser gun over his shoulder and navigated the weave of bodies and gear strewn along the trench, boot soles sucking at the damp earth with every step. The dawn sharpened the edges of everything. A stray shell casing flashing gold, the chipped enamel of a prayer charm dangling from a splintered post. The world felt raw, revealed, and as he passed, a few nods and tired murmurs greeted him, evidence that the 266th were shaking the night off their shoulders. He ducked beneath the sagging length of tarp and reached the dugout where they'd huddled through the slow hours of last night. Jacrin and Lyra were already inside, squeezed side by side on overturned crates, their breath misting as they ate from battered ration tins. Jacrin spooned cold meat and muttered about the lack of salt, while Lyra smiled around a mouthful, her eyes bright despite the fatigue etched into her face. Thane stepped inside, the warmth, such as it was, enveloping him, the familiar blend of metal, earth, and lingering smoke settling over his senses. He slid onto a crate opposite them, pulled open his own tin, and for a moment the war retreated. There was only the scrape of spoons, the soft clink of cups, and the comfort of camaraderie forged in the relentless churn of survival. Chapter 7, Hive Volcanus. The canvas at the dugout's entrance stirred, and 2 figures squeezed through, Vale first, lean and pale under his battered cap, and Kellen just behind, broad-shouldered and blinking against the smoke and low light. Vale wasted no time.
You all want the word from the Commissar?
His voice was rough, but underneath it hummed a current of energy, the kind that comes with a rare sliver of hope.
Hive Volcanus. Orcs reached it yesterday. Been hammering the walls since, but
He paused to drag a hand through his stubble.
most of them have pulled off us. Looks like their main mob's gone streaming up to the breach in the line.
Jackran stopped chewing.
How many left?
Vale's lips twitched in something like a smile.
Maybe 75, 100 at most. Nothing we can't handle. Most of the greenskin weight's gone north.
Lyra's relief was audible in her exhale, but Kellen shifted, fists clenched on his knees.
Still enough to make noise if they double back.
Vale nodded, the fleeting optimism tempered as always.
Yeah, and there's a death dread still in the mix. Bastards have rigged it with rockets. The recce screen saw the smoke trails and the scaff. It's ugly, but it's just the one, and that's better odds than we've had all week.
The dugout was silent for a heartbeat, the grim arithmetic of war settling over them. Then Jackran let out a soft, rueful chuckle.
So, good news, if you squint.
Vale's gaze flicked around the dim dugout, finding each of them in turn.
It's the closest to good news we're likely to get, considering. The Commissar wants us sharp. If the orcs sweep back, we hold the line. But for now, we've got a fighting chance.
Outside, the morning was gathering force, the promise of the new day shadowed by the distant thunder of the siege. But inside, as rations disappeared and boots tapped nervously against the packed earth, a grain of hope lodged itself among the 266th. Chapter 8. Wah!
Listen up, you runty gits. Will you lot stop your squabbling and listen to the boss? Some of them zogging weak boys scuppered off, too scared to get stuck in with a proper scrap. A bunch of grots what don't know nothing about fighting. But us, we's not like them. We's the biggest, meanest, crumpiest mob in the whole. Wah! The fight we's been waiting for. There's a bunch of Yumis up in that mountain pass, thinking they can hold us off. Ha! They's got no idea what's coming. We's gonna show 'em how real orcs bash heads. Any of you lot what's feeling scared can jog on with the grots. But the rest of us, we's gonna stomp, smash, and crump every Yumi standing in our way.
The orc boss loomed at the center of the ramshackle encampment, a brute even by greenskin standards, broad as a bulkhead and twice as ornery. Scarred lips curled around teeth stained by decades of fighting, his yellow eyes glimmering with malicious anticipation. Bits of scrap metal and bone hung from his battered armor, trophies of battles past, clinking with every swaggering step. One massive fist gripped a power claw stained with fresh oil and something darker. The other rested on the hilt of a battered shooter, its muzzle chewed and scarred. Around him the camp was a vision of orky excess and chaos. Jagged barricades of welded iron and scavenged vehicle parts ringed the perimeter, bristling with spikes and glyphs daubed in red and black. The stench of promethium and burnt meat hung heavy in the morning air, mixing with the acrid tang of fungus beer and the ozone bite of crude energy packs. Squigs darted between the boots of brawling boys who traded punches, teeth, and insults in equal measure, vying for position closest to the boss. Gretchen scurried about, ducking flying wrenches and the occasional boot, hauling crates of ammunition and spare rockets to the front.
Right, you lazy gits, enough chatting. Get your choppers, load up the shooters, and get that ammo moving. We's not gonna let them Humies sit pretty up there, while we's itching for a scrap. Oi, big thief, get the burners stoked, and make sure the rockets ain't all pointed at us this time. This is the moment we's been waiting for. And you lot, somebody kick that death dread till it's walking proper. I want its claws chopping and its cannon spitting. If it don't start roaring soon, I'll crump it myself. Smash some oil in, bash the plate straight, and let the mech boys do their zogging job for once. We's going over the top, boys. This is a real war. that sneaking about. We stomp, we smash, we crump. When day boss says go, we hit 'em hard and don't stop till there's nothing left but scrap and skulls. So get your gear, slap on some more red paint if you got it, and get ready, 'cause today we's gonna show them Yumis what a proper scrap looks like. War!
Chapter 9. The Green Tide. The roars from the greenskin camp suddenly got louder, meaning only one thing.
They're coming.
Vale said.
Everyone, get to positions now!
The whole trench system sprung to life, guardsmen jumping over bodies to reach the positions, clambering up the side of the trench walls to sprint on the sides for extra speed. As the camp erupted into action, Malric sprinted through the churned mud alongside his squad, but it was he who scrambled up the side of the dug-in Chimera first, swinging himself nimbly onto the exposed top half. Settling behind the gunner's yoke, Malric's eyes swept the open plain, the bolter's barrel under his steady grip. The vehicle was sunk deep enough to hide its treads, the hull shrouded by a shallow earthwork, but Malric's vantage from the turret gave him a clear line across no man's land, straight down the open plain. He barked commands down into the fighting compartment, voice taut but resolute.
Driver, engines up. Loader, get the charge ready.
His crew responded in kind, the clang of boots and weapons echoing through the cramped interior as they fell into their well-rehearsed roles. From Malric's position, the battlefield unfurled in full, a panorama of battered trenchworks, guardsmen hustling to their positions, and beyond, the vast pale plain where the orc horde would soon boil forth in a tide of violence. He adjusted the turret, tracking the shifting lines as he relayed orders to neighboring squads through the Chimera's vox, his gaze never wavering from the kill zone ahead. The bolter's controls felt familiar beneath his hands, and as the rising chorus of orc war cries drifted on the wind, Malric steadied his breath, finger poised on the trigger. The Chimera was both shield and spear. Here, in his turret, he would make his stand, ready to unleash fire and steel when the storm finally broke. Out on the horizon, the first silhouettes of the orc horde came into view. Ramshackle war wagons, belching smoke and fire, a rippling wall of rusted plates, jagged spikes, and swaying banners. Engines howled and belched oily plumes into the sky, crude tracks chewing up the ground as the tide advanced. At the rear, the deaf dread lumbered and sputtered, its claws grinding and pistons groaning, barely managing to keep pace with the surging mob. The cacophony of orc roars rolled across the plain, a primal thunder rising in intensity, drowning out the steady rhythm of marching boots and the barked orders within the trenches. Vale's voice cut through the mounting tension like a lass shot, sharp and commanding above the thunder of engines and the muttering in the trenches.
Hold your fire. Wait for my mark. They're not close enough yet.
The order echoed down the line, relayed by sergeants and corporals, rippling through the ranks of jittery guardsmen, clutching their weapons tight. Bolters were pressed against muddy sandbags, laser guns braced and ready, but every finger held back, knuckles white. Malric, tense behind the Chimera's turret, forced his breath steady. Discipline was all that kept panic at bay, and every second brought the orc horde thundering closer, green shapes swelling against the pallid horizon. The air vibrated with the promise of imminent violence, but for now the defenders waited. A single heartbeat stretched impossibly thin. The orcs thundered closer, their grotesque machines clattering within rifle range. The moment hung taut, and then Vale's shout snapped like a whip through the freezing air.
Open fire! Let them have it!
The trench line erupted in light and fury. Crimson lances from the laser guns spat across the no-man's land, strobing through the haze and carving through the ranks of the charging orcs. Bolter rounds barked a deafening rhythm, heavy shells blazing into the mass, detonating with explosive force. The sharp crackle and ozone tang of lasfire mingled with the metallic thunder of bolters, each volley painting the battlefield with searing brilliance. The orcs surged forward, heedless of the storm of fire raking their lines. Battle wagons slewed to a halt in great arcs of churned earth and shattered scrap. In an instant, their armored shutters slammed open, and hulking greenskins poured out in a tidal wave. howling, belligerent shapes leaping from the decks with axes raised high and glyphs daubed in crude, vivid colors across their battered armor. They crashed to the ground, shockwaves of violence rippling through their numbers as each landed, boots digging deep into the churned mud. Roars erupted, guttural and wild, echoing over the din of engines and gunfire. Each orc bellow a challenge to the defenders, a promise of blood and mayhem. Driven by raw aggression, they surged forward in a single monstrous charge, guns blazing and crude blades held aloft, their momentum refusing to break even as lasfire and bolter shells tore ragged holes in their ranks. The orcs answered the fusillade with a furious volley of their own, crude shooters and brutal cannons barking to life. In moments, the trench system of the 266th was hammered by a ragged hail of fire. Slabs of rusted metal, jagged bolts, and roaring slugs whistled overhead, some biting deep into the sandbags, others punching through. Most rounds tore harmless furrows in the mud or ricocheted wildly off the parapets, but not all missed their mark. Here and there, screams rose above the clamour as a few guardsmen fell, struck down mid-shout, or wrenched backwards by the force of the orc gunfire. The survivors pressed lower, adrenaline and discipline driving them to return fire with grim resolve, smoke and ozone thickening in the air as the battle for the trenches raged on. The withering volley from the defenders cut through the green tide with merciless efficiency. By the time the leading edge of the orc assault reached the ruined trench, sprawled before the main line, nearly half their number had been scythed down, torn apart by disciplined lasfire and the bone-shaking blasts of bolters. Some of the survivors hurled themselves into the shattered remains of the forward trench, jostling for what little cover the wreckage could provide. Others, crazed by the scent of blood and the thunder of battle, vaulted over splintered boards and churned earth, pressing their attack ever onward, heedless of the risk. Suddenly, with a guttural bellow, two hulking orcs vaulted over the battered trench edge and crashed down among the guardsmen, their axes swinging with brutal force. In the chaos of mud and smoke, 3 defenders fell beneath the savage onslaught, cut down before their comrades could react. Veil spun, cloak snapping through the haze as he moved with ruthless precision toward the pair of rampaging orcs. He fired his last pistol at the first, the laser carving the smoky air. Then, as the brute swung its jagged axe, Veil stepped to his right, dodging the gleaming blade. He surged forward, coming within a couple feet, and squeezed off a shot that seared through the orc's thick neck. With a quick step to the side, he raised his weapon, firing again. This time the shot struck home, punching through the creature's skull in a burst of white-hot energy. The second orc, undeterred by its companion's collapse, came charging forward, swinging a massive cleaver in a reckless arc, bellowing a war cry that rattled the air. Veil ducked low, boots skidding over the churned mud as the blade hissed past, trailing sparks from a shattered railing. In a heartbeat, he drew his combat knife in a reverse grip, glinting silver in the gunfire strobing haze. In a blur of movement, Veil sidestepped the orc's wild swing, boots splashing in the churned mud. He closed the gap in a heartbeat, driving his blade upward into the thick, corded neck of the brute. Crimson blood spattered across his arm as the orc bellowed, muscles flaring in a last, desperate swing. But Veil was already moving, wrenching his blade free and without hesitation jamming his last pistol against the creature's broad chest. He squeezed the trigger. The shot punched through crude armor and bone, sending a burst of white-hot energy through the orc's heart. The beast convulsed and collapsed, its momentum spent, leaving Veil standing over its twitching corpse, breath harsh in the swirling smoke. Malric, bracing against the Chimera's turret, unleashed a relentless hail of fire into the surging orc mass. Each squeeze of the trigger spat hot death into the green tide, the heavy bolter's rhythm a furious heartbeat above the chaos. Then, with no warning, a shrieking rocket arced through the smoky sky and slammed into the Chimera's front. The world detonated in a burst of shrapnel and smoke. Malric was hurled backwards, pain flaring as he tumbled through the open hatch and landed hard in the mud. For a stunned moment, the world spun around him. Ears ringing but limbs miraculously unbroken, he staggered to his feet, half expecting to find himself torn apart. Somehow, luck or Emperor's grace had spared him. Shaking the grit from his vision, Malric hauled himself upright and clambered back onto the Chimera's battered hull, scanning for his crew.
Is everyone okay?
Shouted Malric, looking into the hatch.
We're all good.
A voice replied.
The rocket didn't get through.
Another said. Malric let of a relived breath before continuing,
I'm going to move the bolter forward.
turning back to the weapon. Malric, his nerves still jangling from the explosion, wasted no time. He wrenched the heavy bolter from its shattered mount, the weapon's weight familiar and reassuring in his hands. With a grunt, he kicked the battered gun over the front of the Chimera, sending it skidding through the churned mud. Leaping down after it, he seized the grip and dragged the smoking, battle-scarred bolter toward a low embankment that rose just behind a smaller trench, opening fire onto the orcs. Chapter 10. Hold the line. Kellen and Thane crouched behind a jagged barricade, mud splattered across their faces, frigid sweat trickling beneath flak collars. The small trench connecting the ruined forward line to the main embankment was alive with gunfire. Each orc that tried to clamber up found themselves in the crosshairs of disciplined defense. Malric and Vale fought with desperate skill, each shot and slash thinning the orc ranks, bodies dropping with every flicker of lasfire or flash of steel. Between them, 9 of the brutes fell in quick succession, their green forms trampled in the mounting chaos. But the tide was unbroken, and suddenly the earth shook with the pounding footfalls of something far more terrible. A massive orc warboss, its bulk swathed in battered iron plates, tusks jutting like the prows of ancient warships, eyes burning with murder. Roaring a guttural challenge, the beast charged straight down the trench, shoving lesser orcs aside with contemptuous swats. Malric and Vale raised their weapons, unleashing a storm of shots, but the blasts did little more than score the orc's scarred hide and clang off its armor with useless sparks. The warboss barreled into them, its sheer mass sending both guardsmen flying, covering them in mud. With a guttural, gurgling laugh that seemed to bruise the very air, the orc warboss towered over the battered barricade, casting a monstrous shadow across Thane and Kellen. Its iron-plated boots sent tremors through the mud as it stomped forward, every step a grim drumbeat of impending doom. For a breathless instant, everything seemed to freeze, the guardsmen stunned in their scattered positions, the orcs silenced by the monstrous presence of their warlord, even the ceaseless crack of lasgun fire overhead. The warboss lifted its massive claw, swiping aside sandbags and splintered planks as if they were nothing, roaring with a voice that shook the foundations of the trench. Kellen, half buried in mud, blinked away grit and forced himself upright, lasgun shaking in his hand. Thane, bruised but unbroken, scrambled to grab his own last gun, gritting his teeth as he picked up the battered weapon. The warboss stomped forward, boots sinking deep into the churned earth, eyes locked on the 2 defenders. With a thunderous snarl, the warboss's arm shot out, iron-plated claws closing around Thane before he could even fire. Metal shrieked against flak armor as the orc lifted him from the ground, mud and debris tumbling from Thane's boots as he dangled helplessly in the monster's vice-like grip. The beast began to squeeze slowly around Thane, who was kicking and punching the beast, feeling his chest get tighter with each second, the light around his vision dimming with each passing second. Suddenly, a barrage of lasfire struck the orc, who turned to see Kellen in a firing position on a knee. The orc let out a smile, locking eyes with Kellen, releasing its grip slightly on Thane. Thane took deep breaths, regaining the air he lost, but before his 4th breath, everything went black. The warboss, with one great squeeze, crushed Thane, his body going limp.
Ah!
Kellen let out a scream of hate before firing once again. The orc laughed and hurled Thane's body into Kellen, knocking him to the ground, sending his lasgun flying. Now the orc strode past him deeper into the trench, shooting another guardsman who was unaware of the beast's presence. Kellen looked at the body of Thane before seeing the group of orcs from down the trench sprint towards him, grabbing Thane's knife on his belt. He tried to get free, but it was to last. The orcs were already on top of him and began to hack him into pieces. A distance down the battered line, Vale, Jacran, and Lyra huddled behind splintered timber, exchanging bursts of lasfire with the surging orc mob. The air was thick with the stink of promethium and the sharp tang of ozone from discharged weapons. Lyra's face was set in a mask of grit and resolve, picking off advancing shapes with the steady rhythm of a seasoned marksman. Jackryn, lips tight, reloaded as fast as his trembling hands would allow, shouting range calls over the cacophony. Amid the relentless orc assault, Vale pressed closer to the shattered timber, sweat mingling with the grime on their forehead. The battle's din was broken by the mechanical screech and thunder of something more menacing. Through a haze of smoke and lasfire, the hulking silhouette of a deaf dread lumbered into view at the edge of no man's land. Its crude iron claws and whirring saws gleamed wickedly as it advanced, flattening craters and corpses alike with every ponderous step.
Jackryn!
Vale shouted, voice raw and urgent above the storm of gunfire.
Missile launcher! Now! The deaf dread's almost in range.
Jackryn's head snapped up, eyes wide as he caught sight of the orc war machine stalking through the chaos. He scrambled in the mud, boots slipping, hands fumbling with the heavy launcher slung along his back. Lyra's lasfire kept the surging orcs at bay, but the ground shook with the deaf dread's approach.
Hurry!
Vale barked, ducking as shrapnel and earth exploded overhead. Jackryn braced the launcher on his shoulder, jaw set and breath held, tracking the iron beast as it closed in. For a tense heartbeat, time seemed to pause, the battered defenders holding out hope as Jackryn squeezed the trigger, sending the missile screaming through smoke and ruin toward the advancing deaf dread, desperation and resolve shining in Vale's gaze. Further down the trench line, Malik's hands were blistered and raw from clutching the bolter, his ears ringing from the relentless roar as he spat round after round at the looming orcs. Brass casings pooled at his feet, and each squeeze of the trigger felt heavier than the last. He could feel the weapon stuttering as the magazine neared empty, each shot more desperate, more precious. The battered chimera behind him belched smoke and sparks, its hull pitted with shrapnel and lasburns. Malik barely registered the shouted warning before a shrill whistle cut through the din. Another rocket streaked overhead, trailing a snarling thread of fire, and struck the chimera dead on. The world erupted. Metal shrieked, flames blossomed hungrily from the engine deck, and the force hurled Malik sideways into the mud. The bolter skittered from his grasp, lost in the haze of acrid smoke and licking fire. For a heartbeat, all sound dulled, replaced by the crackle of burning promethium and the screams of wounded comrades as the chimera blazed behind him, a beacon for the advancing green tide. Through the swirling smoke and chaos, the battered chimera ground its treads and jolted forward, defying its wounds with a convulsive shudder. Malric, ears ringing and vision blurred, barely registered the heavy vehicle bearing down on his position until the scorched hull loomed above him, its engine roaring with fury. Adrenaline surged through his battered body, instinct screamed louder than any thought. Malric, lungs burning and vision swimming, staggered upright and half fell, half dived back into the relative cover of the trench. He barely had time to hope the ruined chimera might grind to a halt above, shielding him from the onslaught, when the sodden earth betrayed him. The battered wall of the trench, hammered by shellfire and shuddering with the weight of destruction, buckled suddenly beneath his boots. A roar of collapsing mud swallowed his cry as Malric plunged downward, clawing futilely at the slick clay. The world constricted, dark, suffocating, pressing in from all sides until the ground above burst open in a final catastrophic crash. The flaming hull of the chimera, its metal innards shrieking in protest, toppled with a thunderous impact, slamming straight down into the ruined trench. For a moment, firelight flickered through cracks in the mud, and the world was nothing but crushing weight, choking heat, and the fading echoes of battle above. Chapter 11. In Death Does Duty End? For an instant, Jackryn's heart stalled as the chimera detonated. One moment a battered bulwark, the next a roaring pyre, flames clawing at the sky. Through the shroud of smoke, he couldn't help but wonder if Malric had escaped, or if the hellish inferno had claimed another friend. Guilt gnawed at his focus, but Vale's snapped command cut through the haze of panic.
Jackryn! The death dread! Now!
Gritting his teeth, Jackran forced his mind back to the living, back to duty. He shouldered the missile launcher once more, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. The Orc walker staggered from the first missile's blast, one leg ablaze, black oil pouring down its side as it reeled, but still it lumbered forward, saws spinning, cannons thundering. Lyra's lasfire carved through the gloom, staccato bursts keeping the Orcs' heads down as Jackran wrenched open the launcher's breech. Smoke stung his eyes, but he jammed in another missile, deaf to everything but his own pounding heartbeat.
Covering you!
Lyra shouted, her voice raw but resolute. Jackran's hands moved on instinct, slamming the launcher's breech closed with a satisfying clack. The familiar heft of the weapon steadied his nerves, and through the chaos, through the shriek of burning machines and the thunder of Orc guns, he found a terrible clarity. He rose from behind the shattered barricade, missile launcher braced against his shoulder and sighted down its battered length. Jackran raised the missile launcher, breath held as he sighted through the smoke and chaos. The deaf dread loomed monstrous, its silhouette wreathed in flame, jagged saws shrieking as it barreled closer. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to a trembling crosshair and the oily, lumbering target. He squeezed the trigger, the missile streaked from the tube with a shriek, trailing a comet's tail through the scarlet gloom. Time slowed. Jackran watched the warhead dart through the haze, past the crouched forms of his squad, and plunge squarely into the Orc walker's chest. The deaf dread exploded in a roiling eruption of flame and shrapnel, its metal carcass torn apart as jagged remnants spun through the gloom. Jackran barely had time to register the victory when, from somewhere in the chaos, a slug hammered into his chest with bone-snapping force, a guttural Orc war cry echoing through the haze. The shot hurled Jackran backwards, one instant upright. The next he was tumbling, ears ringing, the ground a brutal, unforgiving certainty against his spine. The world spun in a smear of smoke and fire. He tried to push himself upright, but his legs refused, hollow and numb beneath him, a tide of pain rolling through his body with every attempted breath. Boots scraped against rubble. Lyra knelt at his side, dragging him behind the scant shelter of a twisted bulkhead.
Jackran, stay with me!
She barked, her hands rough but careful as she checked him for wounds, lasegun laid across her knees, eyes darting from his face to chest. He coughed, tasting blood and ash, reaching for the launcher with trembling fingers.
I'm fine,
he croaked, though the lie was obvious. Lyra shook her head, jaw set with stubborn resolve, and in that moment Jackran was content to trust her strength when his own had run dry. Through the haze, a new presence carved its way with indomitable purpose. A tall figure draped in a tattered greatcoat, one arm held high and steady, gripping a chainsword whose teeth still wept Orc oil. The commissar's eyes were cold and unyielding beneath the brim of his cap. The pallor of his face streaked with battle grime. He strode across the shattered line, boots crunching against spent cartridges and twisted metal, never once breaking his relentless pace. The chainsword's motor purred in anticipation, a brutal counterpoint to the distant screams of war. In a single motion, the commissar halted beside Sergeant Vale, his gaze sharp enough to slice through the smoke.
Sergeant,
He barked, voice as crisp as a bolt round.
report. What is our situation?
Vale, battered but unbowed, snapped to attention, las pistol lowered but ready, sweat and soot streaking his temples. For a heartbeat, the chaos seemed to draw back, waiting on the words that would decide their next desperate move. Sergeant Vale's salute was brisk, little more than a battered fist to chest. His voice carried the edge of fatigue, yet each word was clipped with discipline.
Orcs are in the trench, sir. Few left. We've whittled their numbers down, but they're still fighting. The Deaf Dread's been destroyed.
He paused, jaw tightening for a moment.
But our Chimera's gone too.
Overhead, the sky reverberated with las rifle fire. Vale glanced past the commissar toward trench's edge.
We're holding, but barely. Ammo's low. Casualties are mounting.
The commissar's eyes flickered, assessing, but his expression remained iron. He nodded once, a gesture that felt like an order in itself.
We press on. Consolidate your survivors. The trench must hold. Reinforcements will come, or we'll be their line.
His grip tightened on the chainsword, knuckles pale. Vale straightened. There was exhaustion in his shoulders, but when he spoke it was with a defiant spark.
Understood, sir. We'll make a stand.
And as the commissar turned to survey the battered defenders, the war raged on, grinding, relentless, but shadowed now by the grim promise of those who would not yield. A guttural roar split the thunder of gunfire as 4 orcs, hulking and green-skinned, rounded the fractured corner of the trench. Their boots spat mud, crude axes and pistols raised, the hunger for violence gleaming in their eyes. For a moment, time seemed to stutter. The battered defenders froze, hearts thudding, as the savage silhouettes closed in. Vale didn't hesitate. He shot a glance to Lyra, voice low but fierce.
Stay with Jacqueline. Don't let him move. If they break through, protect him.
Lyra nodded, knuckles white around her laser gun, her gaze never leaving the wounded trooper at her side. Without another word, Vale pivoted, meeting the commissar's steely look. Instinct and duty fused in a single heartbeat. The 2 men charged forward side by side, boots pounding on churned earth. The commissar's chainsword snarled to life, teeth whirring with savage intent, while Vale raised his last pistol and loosed a bolt at the nearest orc. The air crackled with energy as orders gave way to action. Vale and the commissar, drawn together by desperation and resolve, surged toward the oncoming threat, determined that the trench would not fall while breath and steel remained. Behind them, Lyra crouched beside Jacqueline, watching the clash begin. Grit and hope twined tightly between her teeth as the battle's outcome hung in the smoke-laced air.
Why?
The orcs surged, brutal bellowing, swinging their axes with reckless abandon. 2 broke for the commissar, the other pair for Vale, boots pummeling mud, tusked jaws split in snarls. No time for subtlety, only the sudden, sharp calculus of survival. The commissar ducked beneath the first blow, chainsword hacking upward in a savage riposte. Blade teeth screeched through crude armor, hot blood spattering the trench wall. The second orc lunged, pistol-barking wild shots that stung the air. But the commissar twisted, feinting left before driving the blade down. Sparks and arterial spray followed, the orc falling with a guttural gurgle. Vale's arm trembled as he squeezed the trigger, the last bolt searing through rain and smoke to pierce the first orc's leathery neck. The brute recoiled, clutching at the wound, but Vale pressed forward, teeth gritted and lungs burning, firing again. The orc collapsed in a heap of green muscle and battered armor. But as Vale surged past, the world spun. The second orc, undeterred by its fallen kin, swung a heavy boot into Vale's side, a jarring, bone-rattling kick that sent him crashing down against the blood-spattered trench wall. With a thunderous bellow, the orc hurled its bulk forward, trying to leap atop its prey, jagged axe raised overhead and murder burning in its red eyes. A guttural snarl from the orc, instinct took hold. Vale raised his last pistol and squeezed the trigger, sending a single searing shot straight into the looming orc's skull. The creature's head snapped back with a hiss of vaporized flesh, momentum driving its heavy body sideways. It crashed against the trench wall, leaving a slick arc of blood as it folded in a heap, monstrous features slackened in sudden death. The echo of the last discharge faded, but the violence lingered, sharp and metallic on the air, as Vale braced himself for whatever would come next. The clash of battle ebbed for a heartbeat, the stench of blood thick as the acrid haze parted, just enough for Vale to see the monster that awaited. Looming above the churned mud and broken bodies, a warboss stood, massive, bristling with crude armor plates and festooned with trophies. Its tiny burning eyes fixed on the commissar, tusked jaw twisted into a sneer that could have soured steel. The 2 locked gazes in a tableau of raw defiance. The commissar's coat hung ragged, blood dappling the sash, but his eyes blazed with the same iron as his sword. The warboss bellowed, voice a guttural avalanche.
You call that the sword? Umi, I seen sharper teeth in a squig's backside.
He spat a wad of black phlegm, boots squelching as he pounded a fist against his chest plate, dented and scratched from 100 such duels. Chapter 12. The Warboss. The warboss rumbled forward, each stride sending tremors through the rubble-choked earth. His axe, a brutal slab of iron festooned with the teeth of fallen enemies, swung up in a slow arc, daring the commissar to approach. The trench seemed to contract around the warboss's bulk, every rivet and shadow shuddering under the weight of his presence. Shouts and gunfire receded into distant thunder, the world narrowing to the brutal immediacy of the standoff. The commissar's knuckles whitened on his chainsword hilt, teeth set in a grimace carved from resolve and exhaustion both. Vale, chest heaving, wiped a smear of blood from his brow and forced himself upright. His limbs trembled, but his eyes found the commissar's, drawing what little steadiness he could from that flinty stare. Somewhere behind, Lyra pressed a hand to Jacren's shoulder, anchoring them both with the quiet promise that they were not alone. The warboss flexed, iron muscles rolling beneath green hide, and drew a cleaver so massive it looked as though it had been torn from a vehicle hull and hammered into shape by brute force. Studded with teeth and the broken badges of fallen foes, the blade gleamed dully in the weak light. His laughter was a thunderclap, rolling over the defenders like a challenge, like the promise of violence yet to come. The two combatants charged.
Warg!
The warboss's bellow shook the trench, his power claw stretched open ready to meet the commissar's head. His power claw snapped like a steel trap where the commissar's head had been moments before, gouging fist-sized clods from the sodden wall. The chainsword's teeth had chewed a ragged trench in the orc's thigh, oily black blood hissing onto the churned earth. But pain was only fuel for the warboss. He grinned wider, showing tusks cracked and stained from 100 campaigns, and drove forward, every step a threat, every breath a challenge. The commissar circled, boots slipping on mud slick with blood and fouled promethium. The warboss's cleaver came down in a murderous arc, the air thrumming with its passage, but the commissar slid aside, cloak flaring, bringing his sword up for another desperate feint. Sparks flew as steel met crude iron, the impact jarring the commissar's arm to the shoulder. Vale watched, heart pounding, not with fear, but with a terrible awe at the raw power each combatant wielded. The duel had become its own silent theatre, the world at the edge of its seat. Revving the blades and cutting away at flesh, the commissar grinned. Before he could pull the weapon from the orc, he felt an excruciating pain in his legs. The orc had stepped on the commissar's legs, snapping them, causing him to fall. As he fell, the warboss spun, and as soon as the commissar hit the floor, the warboss stomped down onto the commissar's head, crushing it. Chapter 13, The Last Stand. For a moment, silence hung between Vale and the warboss. A taut line drawn in blood and dusk. Vale's boots planted in the heart of the trench, battered but unbroken, he stared down the monster who had just ended the commissar. The warboss's glare was a furnace, but Vale did not flinch, not even as his chest heaved and his vision swam. Steel met savage yellow, and something ancient and animal flickered between them. Then, with a grunt of disdain, the warboss broke the spell. He spun on his heel, hurling a guttural command over his shoulder. The orc stood, crude blades and jagged guns raised, their howls swelling to fill the trench with chaos. The warboss didn't spare another glance. He strode away, boots pounding, in search of fresh victims elsewhere on the ruined battlefield. Vale found himself the new center of the storm, Lyra and Jacren close, faces pale with fear, but refusing surrender. The orcs closed in, eyes bright with the promise of slaughter. Vale tightened his grip on his las pistol, the weapon slick with sweat and blood, and squared his shoulders as the last stand began. He glanced behind, catching Lyra's eye. Her face was streaked with filth, but her grip on Jacren was iron. Vale motioned them closer, voice hoarse but resolute.
We hold here.
Gonna gut you, Hughie!
Shouts from orcs filled the air as Vale advanced through the blood-soaked trench, alert for movement. Jacren, wounded, struggled to stand with Lyra's help while gunfire and explosions continued overhead. Listening for the right moment, they dashed through chaos and debris, determined to survive together. Despite the devastation, hope persisted among the battered group. Suddenly the orcs stepped, hulking figures blocking their path and bellowing with rage. Weapons raised, the brutes pounded the earth, ready to unleash a furious charge. The tension was electric. Vale and the others braced themselves for the oncoming assault, hearts pounding in anticipation. Vale squeezed the trigger, his last pistol barking fire as Lyra and Jacrin joined him in a desperate fusillade. Crimson bolts tore through the gloom, striking down the nearest orcs in explosions of blood and bone. The trench crackled with energy and death, the trio carving a brief sanctuary from the onslaught. For a heartbeat it seemed possible. Bodies fell, monstrous forms crumpling under the hail. But the orcs were relentless. The dead were only the first ripple as the surviving beasts surged forward, roaring in blind fury, tusks gnashing, boots pounding. The ground itself seemed to quake with their charge. Vale shouted a warning, but the orcs were almost upon them, massive shadows blotting out the shattered sky. They braced themselves, weapons up, as the storm broke and the trench became a crucible of violence and defiance. As the last of the crimson bolts faded, Vale's gaze fell on the fallen commissar, his broken body sprawled in the mud, the battered chainsword still clutched in a death grip. Without hesitation, Vale knelt, pried the weapon free, its weight both familiar and foreign in his hands. The engine sputtered, and then roared to life, a savage hymn rising above the din. With a cry that was half fury, half defiance, Vale surged forward, chainsword singing. The first orc lunged, cleaver raised, only to be met by the whirring steel. The blade bit deep, kicking up a shower of gore. Another brute charged, but Vale spun, blade flashing, a brutal arc that tore through armor and bone. Lyra and Jacrin, crouched in the shadow of the trench wall, kept up a relentless barrage, covering him. Lashbolts stitched the air, driving back those who tried to flank, their courage redoubled by Vale's audacity. He was a whirlwind now, cutting, slashing, driving the orcs back step by bloody step. For every monster felled beneath the chainsword's teeth, two more pressed in, but Vale did not falter. The weapon's roar mingled with the cries of the dying, a beacon of resistance amid ruin. Lyra called out, her voice sharp.
Left flank.
Jacrin fired, his aim true despite the pain, picking off a brute that nearly reached Vale's exposed side. Together they formed a wall of desperation and hope, refusing to yield. The trench had become a crucible of violence and resolve, a place where the last stand found its teeth. By the time the chainsword's teeth stuttered and slowed, the ground was littered with fallen orcs, the living ones hesitating, uncertain. Vale stood over the body, breath ragged, blood running down his arm, but alive. Lyra and Jacrin rejoined him, eyes bright with wild relief. The chainsword, dripping and battered, was their new standard, a symbol that even in the jaws of annihilation, some stands were never broken. But as the echoes faded, Jacrin staggered, the weight of his wounds finally too much to bear. He collapsed to his knees, lasgun slipping from trembling fingers, and Lyra caught him before he hit the ground. She pulled him close, voice cracking as she spoke his name, cradling his head in her lap amid the churned mud and shattered bodies. Vale staggered beneath the renewed onslaught, an avalanche of green muscle and fury surging over the corpses of their kin. A jagged blade caught his shoulder, slicing through fatigues and flesh. Pain blossomed, sharp and immediate, but he refused to yield. The chainsword shuddered in his grip, its snarl growing weaker, but he swung it still, carving desperate arcs through the encroaching tide. Blood, his own, theirs, spattered his visor, blurring the world into chaos and crimson. Lyra, seeing Vale falter, snatched up her lasgun and took aim with trembling hands. She fired in quick, feverish bursts, the air sizzling with red energy, but it was not enough. The orcs pressed closer, undeterred by loss or pain, their guttural bellows echoing off the muddy walls. She screamed his name, desperate for the enemy to break, for the tide to recede. But the monsters kept coming, boots pounding, tusks gleaming, eyes burning with savage joy. Vale dropped to one knee, clutching his ruined shoulder, the chainsword heavy as iron. The trench narrowed, the hope of sanctuary flickering, and every heartbeat felt stolen from the jaws of death. Yet, even as the world closed in, his gaze found Lyra, her courage, her defiance, and he forced himself upright, battered but unyielding, determined that their resistance would be written in blood and memory, no matter the cost. Chapter 14. Death from Above. A thunderous roar split the sky, an unnatural bellow that silenced even the orcs mid-charge. All eyes, friend and foe alike, turned upward as a black shape screamed through the clouds, trailing fire and promise. The drop pod hurtled earthward like the fist of some vengeful god, its hull wreathed in flame, impact inevitable. The drop pod slammed into the earth beside the trench, detonating mud, shattered bodies, and broken steel in a tornado of sound and force. The shockwave hit like a hammer. Lyra and Vale hurled from their feet, limbs flailing, pain and grit filling every sense. For an instant, the world became nothing but thunder and flying debris, a chaos where even the orcs recoiled, their bellows snatched away by the cataclysm. From the settling dust, the drop pod stood out, its hull painted a deep, martial red, scorched but unyielding. The doors burst open with a hydraulic hiss, exhaling steam and the acrid tang of ozone. Figures in ceramite armor strode forth, their visors glowing beneath the pallid sky, each movement purposeful and terrible. Space Marines, angels of war, emerged, bolters already blazing, the air erupting in a storm of thunderous gunfire. Shells tore through orc ranks, each shot precise and devastating, the heavy rounds punching through green flesh and ragged metal. The orcs, momentarily stunned, howled in dismay as the newcomers carved a swift swathe of ruin among them. The trench was ablaze with hope renewed. Crimson-armored giants advanced without pause, their presence a promise that the tide could yet be turned. Lyra, half buried in mud and disbelief, stared wide-eyed as the Marines pressed forward, their every step shaking the earth. Vale, battered and bloodied, found strength in the thunderous arrival, clutching his chainsword as if the fire of their salvation burned through him. Above the carnage, the standards of the Emperor flew, red, resolute and unbroken, while the orcs floundered, their charge shattered, their courage shaken by the arrival of humanity's finest. Lyra clawed her way upright, ignoring the grit in her eyes and the tremor in her limbs. The world thundered around her, bolter fire, screams, the relentless drum of battle, but she forced herself onward, stumbling through mud and ruin toward Vale. He swayed, blood streaking his face, spent and dazed, but she caught him under the arm and half dragged, half carried him towards the broken remnants of the trench wall.
Hold on,
she hissed, voice raw. Together they staggered, each step a defiance of pain and fear. Behind them, the Space Marines advanced in a disciplined line, red armor ablaze against the pallor of smoke and sky. Orcs surged to meet them, a sea of brute force and fury, but the Marines answered every charge with disciplined violence, bolters barking, chainswords roaring, each motion a statement of unwavering resolve. Lyra hauled Vale behind a twisted girder, pressing them into the scant shelter as gunfire rattled overhead. She could see the Marines, avatars of vengeance, carving a path through the green horde, every movement precise and final. Steam hissed from shattered earth, ozone thick in the air. The orcs faltered, confused by the sudden fury unleashed upon them.
Stay with me, Sergeant,
she murmured, checking his wound and bracing herself for what came next. She gripped her lasgun, knuckles white, ready to fight if they must. But for a brief, impossible moment, hope flickered in the war-torn mire, a hope born of crimson armor and imperial banners, shimmering through the chaos as the Emperor's chosen held the line and drove back the tide. A surge of awe cracked through Lyra's exhaustion, and with raw, bruised lungs, she cried,
"The sons of Sanguinius are here! The Red Angels!"
Her voice, half a sob, half a battle cry, cut through the storm of war. Even the orcs hesitated at the words, but hope is a fragile thing on the battlefield. In the maelstrom, a single heavy round struck a Marine's crimson pauldron, skittering off the ceramite with a banshee wail. In a cruel arc, it ricocheted, spinning, shrieking toward Lyra. She looked up, breath freezing in her chest, as the stray round slammed into her just above her heart. For a heartbeat, she remained standing, eyes wide with disbelief. The world slowed. Bolter fire faded, the banners and blood and thunder receded to a dull ache, and Lyra's gaze dropped to the spreading crimson blossoming beneath her torn flak. She staggered, teetering on uncertain feet, the world narrowing to a single thread of pain. Her lasgun slipped from numb fingers, thudding into the mud. The crimson stain bloomed across her chest, vivid as the banners that had summoned hope, and her knees buckled. Vale reached for her, agony twisting his features, but his battered body refused to respond. The wound in his side anchoring him, a chain of flesh and defeat. He watched, powerless, as Lyra slumped beside him, her breath coming in fragile, ragged bursts. Her eyes found his, wide and searching, the storm of battle reflected in their glassy depths. Around him, the Space Marines moved with the brutal certainty of war gods made flesh. Their bolters erupted in orchestrated volleys, each explosive round tearing through orc ranks with thunderous efficiency. Green bodies hurled backwards, limbs severed, crude armor shattered by the sheer force of Imperial firepower. Chainswords bit and whirred, rending muscle and bone with mechanical hunger, the air filling with the metallic tang of blood and ozone. Wherever the orcs rallied, the Blood Angels crashed through their lines, scattering mobs that moments before had seemed unbreakable. The tactical squad advanced in perfect formation, their discipline unyielding amid the chaos as the sergeant barked orders over the clamor. From the shifting haze, the hulking silhouette of the orc war boss emerged, towering above his kin, tusks jutting, armor scavenged and spiked, a crude power claw flexing hungrily at his side. With a guttural roar that split the carnage, he thrust his power claw high,
Space Marine!
Bellowing a challenge that thundered across the battlefield. Orcs rallied to his cry, but parted before his lumbering bulk as he charged, every footfall pounding craters into the mud, his eyes locked on the crimson-clad Marines. The sergeant of the Blood Angels pivoted, his gaze keen behind the scarlet helm. In that instant, the world narrowed to two figures, one an avatar of brutal cunning, the other of righteous wrath. The sergeant raised his chainsword in salute, Voxcaster amplifying his voice over the fray.
Face me, beast. The Emperor's judgment falls upon you.
The warboss howled in savage delight, slamming aside lesser orcs as he barreled forward, crude weapons crackling with stolen energy. Space Marines tightened their formation, bolters lowering in a disciplined arc to grant their sergeant the sacred honor of single combat. The trench itself seemed to tremble as the warboss bore down, each stride a promise of violence. Steel rang out as the collision came, a thunderclap of ceramite and green muscle, power claw meeting chainsword in a spray of sparks and ozone. The warboss swung with feral strength, each blow enough to fell a lesser foe, but the sergeant answered with seasoned precision, blade dancing between arcs of lethal energy. The duel painted a violent ballet amidst ruin, the sergeant's sword cut deep, the warboss replying with guttural laughter and bone-cracking swipes. All around, the momentum of the battle shifted. Blood Angels pressed their advantage, driving what remained of the orc horde into broken, desperate knots. The air trembled with the finality of Imperial vengeance as bolters roared and chainswords spat fury. But at the heart of the storm, the duel raged on, a brutal testament to the will of gods and monsters. The warboss hammered an iron fist into the earth, sending clods of mud arcing, his power claw crackling with stolen lightning. He swung again, a wide, savage arc, but the sergeant twisted beneath the blow, scarlet cape trailing in the chaos. Their weapons met with a shriek that split the sky, sparks cascading like comets, every collision a promise of death. Breathless, battered, the sergeant pressed the attack, each movement a litany of devotion and duty, his sword carving through the haze, driving the warboss back, step by relentless step. The orc bellowed, tusks stained red, swinging with all the fury of his dying kin. But the son of Sanguinius would not yield. In a moment that hung suspended between thunder and silence, the sergeant feinted left, then surged right, chainsword singing as it arced upward in a swift, merciless stroke. Steel flashed. The blade found its mark, buried deep beneath the jutting tusks, parting sinew and bone with righteous fire. The warboss lurched, blood geysering from his neck, eyes wide with primal disbelief. The sergeant stood resolute as the monster toppled, crimson blade glinting, and with one final decisive motion severed the warboss's head, lifting it for all to see. Chapter 15, 3rd Company. Smoke curled in greasy plumes from the shattered trenchworks as the Blood Angels' squad advanced in disciplined silence, boots crunching over broken bodies and discarded weaponry. Their bolters spat methodical judgment, each shot a final punctuation to the Orc incursion. No quarter was given, no greenskin spared, as the Marines swept from firing step to firing step, crimson armor wreathed in the settling haze of battle. One among the Blood Angels paused by the twisted wreckage of a destroyed chimera, its battered hull half sunken in the mire. His gaze swept the ruin, augmetic eye flickering in the gloom as he noted the burnt-out hulk and the mangled insignia still clinging to its flank. Then a sound, faint, barely rising above the whisper of settling ash, yet unmistakable. A muffled voice, strained and desperate, emanating from beneath the battered transport. The Marine stilled, senses sharpening. He moved next to the wreckage and stopped. With practiced strength, he braced his shoulder against the Chimera's ruined side and heaved, servos in his power armor whining in protest. Metal groaned, shifting, revealing a narrow pocket beneath the wreckage. From the shadows, a battered Guardsman, Malric, peered up, his face streaked with grime and blood, eyes wide with mingled fear and hope. As the muffled plea became clearer,
Please, Lord, help.
Malric's gaze focused, and for an instant, disbelief eclipsed his desperation. The towering figure above him was no ordinary rescuer, but a Blood Angel, his crimson armor gleaming through the haze, every line etched with the legend of impossible wars. For a heartbeat, Malric's breath caught. The tales whispered in barracks could not compare to the reality of a space marine standing over him, offering salvation in the Emperor's name. The Blood Angel extended a gauntleted hand, voice resonant with the iron promise of deliverance.
The Emperor protects. Take hold.
Around them, the silence of aftermath was broken only by Malric's labored breaths and the distant thunder of vengeance pursued elsewhere. Rescue, like death, was dealt with unwavering resolve upon this scarred and holy ground. The Space Marine's helm turned, sensors flickering in the smoky gloom as the distant grind of treads signaled the approach of salvation. A fresh chimera rumbled over the cratered ground, its flanks scrubbed clean of ash, Imperial insignia still proud upon battered plating. The Blood Angel gestured with a silent authority, gauntlet rising, an unspoken signal.
You held the line, Guardsmen. You're needed elsewhere now.
The Space Marine intoned, voice layered with the unyielding conviction that marked his kind. Malric's legs trembled as he rose, exhaustion warring with relief. Each step through the ruined trench was a testament to stubborn will, the air thick with the ghosts of what had been lost and won. He climbed into the waiting chimera, the interior dim and warm, a fragile sanctuary from the world's ruin. As he settled on the cold metal bench, the weight of his battered lasgun across his knees, he looked around. Only 6 figures wearing the markings of the 266th remained, himself included. The fresh-faced driver glanced back, eyes wide with equal parts awe and fatigue, and with a lurch, the transport began its retreat. Through the viewport, Malric caught a final glimpse of the crimson-armored giant, haloed in haze and gunmetal light. 6 survivors. He swallowed, a silent roll call echoing in his mind as the Chimera's engine faded into the wounded dawn, carrying them away from the graveyard of their stand and toward whatever orders the Emperor still had for them. In the twilight lingering over the ruined trenchworks, Vale lay exposed atop torn earth and scorched metal, his breath shallow and ragged. The battlefield had grown eerily silent. No cries, no gunfire, save for the distant, persistent roar of an engine carrying survivors away. Blood seeped from his wounds, warm against the chill that crept into his limbs, while his gaze drifted through the smoky air. Muzzle flashes faded, and the faces of fallen comrades lingered in memory, a silent tribute. His fingers rested on his battered lasgun, resolve flickering but unbroken. For a fleeting moment, the crimson form of a Blood Angel passed through the haze, a figure both terrifying and divine. Pride wrestled with pain. Vale had held the line against the green tide, fulfilling his duty to the end. As darkness edged closer and the engine's echo reverberated across the shattered earth, he whispered a final prayer to the Emperor, words trembling, hope undiminished. In those last moments, Vale's sacrifice merged with the silence of aftermath, a testament to courage forever etched beneath the wounded sky.